Hello and welcome to Radio VR, the voice of Russia, live from London. I'm Scott Craig. The well-being and prosperity of any nation is underwritten by the strength of its education system. And here in Britain, schools in England and Wales have undergone a number of reforms in recent years. And depending on your take, the Education Secretary Michael Gove is either bravely tackling institutional inertia and injecting a healthy dose of competition into Britain's educational system, or he's guilty of imposing a political agenda on what should be a purely educational debate. But what is the public to make of all of this? What do the reforms actually mean? And what about Mr. Gove's language, which it would be charitable to say has rubbed many in the educational sector up the wrong way? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Diane Shawe, Vice Chair and Secretary of the Conservative Education Society Executive Committee. Also joining us is Shaun Humphreys, Policy Advisor to the National Association of Head Teachers. Professor James Tooley is Head of Education Policy at Newcastle University. And Margaret Heffernan is an author and speaker who's written widely about education. Thank you all for joining me on Radio VR. And just for clarity for our audience, I should say we did invite the National Union of Teachers to take part in the discussion, but no one was available. I think since we are an international broadcaster, before we really get into this, I think it would be helpful if we could at least define some of these things that we're talking about that an international audience might not be aware of. Things like free schools, academy schools. Who would like to, I don't want to make it sound like an exam, but who would like to define what is a free school and what is an academy school?
Shall I have a go?
Please.
There are two broad categories of school in England. You mentioned England and Wales before, but I think it's interesting that change in Wales is starting to diverge quite considerably from that being pursued in England. So just concentrating in England, there are state-funded schools and there are private schools. State-funded schools are divided into ones which are run by the locality, the local authority, and those which are independent of that, and those are called academies, and a variety of that are free schools. The independent schools are outside that system and receive their funding primarily from the fees that parents pay, but also perhaps because they're charitable and have got their own resources as well.
Diane Shawe, when we look at some of the major reforms, what do you think are really the major points of reform in the system? I mean, is it things like bringing in a new national curriculum? Is it standardized or younger testing? What is it that you think is on the reform agenda that you think is particularly significant?
Well, I think we are seeing in our global state that technology is forging ahead. And when you look at a 4-year-old, for instance, and they have a complete synergy with a tablet, you have to think, what is it going to be like when they get to school and they're 9 or 10 and 11, and how are they going to work with the teachers that are tutoring them? So I think a holistic approach needs to be looked at without any real emphasis in any specific area. For instance, I think, yes, we do need to update the curricula because we need to educate people for the jobs of the future. But in the same breath, we also have a lot of people who have gone through the system that also needs a way of us reaching out to them.
Shaun Humphreys, when you were looking at this, the reforms that have come in or been announced over the past couple of years, what do you think are the really significant things? Because all education secretaries come in, be they Labour, be they Conservative, they come in, they say, yes, I have a new agenda, I have new ideas, this is working, that's not working. But in the case of Michael Gove, are these really deep-seated reforms which he's bringing in?
You mentioned before, is it institutional inertia or fighting that, or is it a distinctive political agenda? I don't think that's an either or. I think there's the third thing, which is Michael Gove's place in history as well. But I think the thing that links that is the pace of the reforms is, I think, designed for political reasons to make them very, very difficult to undo whatever happens in 2015 at the next election. That's probably good politics. Now, when we look at the actual individual bits of reform, I think our approach in the NAHT is to not automatically knee-jerk say this is bad, because we're equally critical of the aspects of New Labour's policy as well, but to look at the reforms on a piece-by-piece basis. But I think the thing that particularly concerns us is, notwithstanding our support or not for particular aspects of change, is the pace of change and the way in which that appears very, very unfragmented, and the implications for certainly school leaders and teachers in having to implement this within extremely tight schedules. And I think from the political point of view, there's an actual danger there, because if these reforms are not successfully implemented, then they won't achieve that which they purport to seek to achieve. So I think there's an interesting political tension there.
You look at these things on a piece-by-piece basis rather than looking at the whole reform package. What do you think he's got right in terms of reform?
The basic premise behind national curriculum reform is sound, the idea to slim the curriculum down. Where we would start to query the way in which it's been done is that, yes, it is a slimmer document than before, and it does give teachers, in theory, some greater autonomy. And Michael Gove's rhetoric on autonomy, freedom for teachers is a prominent aspect of his approach. But there's some extremely prescriptive elements within that, particularly in terms of English and maths. So it could be, but the implementation of those might threaten that autonomy in other areas.
James Tooley, we will come back to this question about rhetoric a bit later, because I think that's an important part of this debate. But James Tooley, on this question of a national curriculum, do you think that is a good idea in terms of being able to turn the situation around, in terms of, if we look at things like figures from the OECD, Britain is 21st in science, 23rd for reading, 26th for maths?
In fact, it's the opposite way around. In 1988, a national curriculum was introduced in this country, and it's become a bureaucratic monolith. And so what Michael Gove, to his credit, is doing is trying to slim this down in order to bring, as I think we've said already, more autonomy, more freedom to schools. So I think where Michael Gove is going right and where he's to be praised is in where he's trying to get rid of bureaucracy, trying to give more freedom to schools. So we've mentioned academies and free schools. He's opened more than 2,000 academies. That's 10 times more than were opened under the last government. He's trying to break the university monopoly on teacher training. That's a great thing, by bringing in Teach First, Teaching Schools, Schools Direct, all these sort of areas, breaking monopoly of what he would call the blob. And he's trying to, as they say, slim down the curriculum so that, yes, you can focus on the major things like literacy and numeracy, but otherwise give more freedom to schools. So these are all good things. I think he can be praised for standing up in this way.
Margaret Heffernan, you've written a piece, Who Will Stop Michael Gove Before It's Too Late? And you go on to look at various aspects of this that all, in essence, come back to the same theme, which is competition. Why inject this theme of competition into education in various guises? I'll let you elaborate on that. But in general, what is wrong with a healthy dose of competition in education? Some students do better than others. Some teachers are better than others. We can't all be A students. You reject the premise of competition in education?
Yes, I do, because Michael Gove might like to call it the blob, which is a pretty unhelpful phrase. But I think, the creation of the academies and the free schools and this whole kind of mishmash of reform is clearly an attempt to create a market in education. And what we know about competitive markets is that they're virtually always unfair. We know that they create a lot of waste, and we know that there are huge areas in which they don't work. And the notion that our kids are going to be kind of parcels fought over in this competitive market, I think, is pretty uninspiring. Kids don't have to be encouraged to be competitive. They are competitive. Encouraging schools to compete with each other militates against sharing knowledge and sharing expertise. The focus on exams is teaching exactly the wrong lessons to kids, which is, first of all, it's the product, not the process, that matters. What you have to do is come out of schools with lots of great grades, because otherwise you are sunk. The world is divided into winners and losers, and if you're not a winner, really, your life is over. Now, if you believe, as Mrs. Thatcher did, that the world or society only needs a few winners, then that system will definitely deliver for you. But if you believe that society needs a vast array of skilled, competent, confident people, then it definitely won't. And I think, what concerns me as someone who's run many businesses and employed thousands of people is that this win-lose mentality is so profoundly unhelpful when kids start working. They really do think, that if they don't get the most attention, if they don't get the best assignments, if they don't get the best grades, that they won't work well. And this creates havoc in the workplace. Now, I don't believe for one moment the only role of education is to create a really inspiring workforce. But as someone who's working at the end of this pipeline of education, I am dismayed by what it is producing, which is the wrong attitude to work, the wrong attitude to learning, inflexible attitudes to knowledge. I think it's absolutely devastating.
May I come in here, Scott?
Please do.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I categorically disagree with everything Margaret has said. And she can't have it both ways. She's describing the current system, bringing this inflexible attitude to knowledge and bringing things that employers and businesses don't want. And then she accuses the Secretary of State for trying to open the system up and improve it. And she says by bringing in a so-called market in education, this will be unfair, wasteful, and so on. What you've got to realize is the current system is unfair. At the moment in the state system, you have allocation by house prices. You have the middle classes getting a superior education to those in what someone once called the bog standard comprehensive. So you've got a terribly unfair system. You've got 20% of school leavers after 11 or so, 12 years of compulsory schooling leaving innumerate and illiterate. What Michael Gove is recognizing, this is a problem, and not being complacent about it. He's saying, okay, well, let's bring in some ways of improving that. The market works in so many other areas. Margaret is not working in the non-profit sector. She knows the advantages of the market. These things can work for schools too, and that's what Michael Gove wants to bring in.
I'm very far from complacent, and I absolutely take your point, that the allocation by house prices or
it's a disgrace.
The allocation by pushing parents definitely doesn't work. But I think what's really striking is that what we do see now is a political competition for certain ideological forms of education. And I think it's really disheartening to see our kids being the battlefield. And I think we have a lot to learn from Finland, where basically educational reform was led by a group of people who said, this is too important to become a political football. What we need to do is we need to get together to put together a wide-ranging series of reforms that we all agree on that will help the outcomes of all of our children.
This is why Finland is sinking down the path.
Shaun, I think you wanted to come in here as well at this stage, and also Diane.
A fairly radical solution. I think probably the single best way of improving state schools would be to look at the whole allocation and admissions process and to be quite prescriptive in terms of the schools in which children go. Because if the middle-class parents who take advantage now of the postcode lottery, and indeed those who pay for education, were injected, so to speak, in across the system, then that pressure would drive up standards.
Isn't that essentially the grammar school system?
Well, I think what happens now is comprehensive schools become quasi-grammar schools because of the postcode lottery. If you look at the distribution of ability and so on between schools in different areas. I think also the point that Margaret was making about the qualities, the attributes of school leavers, I think it's interesting that the types of things that the CBI are saying, which I think probably would reflect Margaret's points, and a report that Pearson commissioned recently with an independent panel of academics and industrialists are saying precisely the same thing, but Mr. Gove is not listening to those people.
Diane Shawe, let me bring you in here.
Yes, I first of all, I think it was politics initially many years ago that helped to structure how we moved forward with our national educational system. And it's interesting that when we want to reform, we always then view politics as the enemy, when once upon a time it was the driver in bringing things together. The second thing that I find very interesting as well is that we seem to attribute some very negative words towards our educational system in this country. And I think we should really look at what type of words we use to associate our great institution around the UK. It might not be perfect, but I think that on the whole, the teachers and the parents and the students are all doing a very, very good thing. And what we are trying to drive home now is to move our educational system into the 21st century. And this in itself means that we have to look at ways of how we can upskill our teachers so as they can embrace technology and not live in fear of it, how the students who are coming up throughout the whole system can also be upskilled and can find quite on no borders or no boundaries in terms of using technology and their own devices into the schools. For instance, look at MOOCs, which is now spanning all over the world and giving free education or access to free education all over. What is that? What's going to be the impact in our classrooms and in our universities? And then lastly, competition. Competition is always healthy. If we look at universities, they compete against each other, and the student and the parent makes the choice. And I don't think that competition should be viewed as a dirty word within the educational world.
Margaret, you come in there.
Competition is always healthy, is preposterous.
Totally.
One reason we don't have any free markets is because we all absolutely recognize that competition regularly and spectacularly backfires. One reason we have epidemic levels of cheating in exams is because the competition for the prize has become so overrated compared to the process of learning. I think the other thing Diane said about technology is really very interesting. As someone who's run technology companies, I'm perhaps a little bit less dazzled by it than other people. I think it definitely has a role to play. But fundamentally, what technology is doing is disrupting the world of work so profoundly that we don't know what we're educating children for. We don't know really what they're going to need to learn in the future.
Shaun Humphreys.
I think one of the problems, I talked about the pace of reform and the implementation. The sequence is wrong. We ought to start with curriculum, then look at assessment, then accountability. Now, the government acknowledged in the consultations for reform that this was out of kilter, and the accountability, the performance tables that Margaret alluded to, have too great an influence and too great a determinant on behaviours in schools. Yet we see very little evidence that that sequence of curriculum, assessment, accountability is what's underpinning the reforms, and teachers do feel battered by that, and that's part of the issue with academies as well, the forced academisation process. All is not rosy in the academy garden.
Shaun, as someone who advises the National Association of Head Teachers, let me ask you, this relationship between teachers and Michael Gove seems to be about more than just conflicting or clashing philosophies of education. It seems to be quite personal, almost, in a way. Clearly, there have been disputes between teachers' unions and the government over things like pay, conditions, pensions and the like. Is that kind of political dispute overshadowing, in a sense, the wider discussion that we're having about education and educational philosophies?
I think if it does descend into that, then it's distracting attention away from the key issues. So, for example, if we look at GCSE reform, the exam that most young people take at the age of 16, that's going to be changed over 3 tranches with different inputs in terms of ways of grading over a 3-year process. that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That's why teachers feel battered. That's the sort of thing which will make the underlying principles of the reforms at risk of being attained.
But do we look at reforming the system in the comfort zone of the teachers, or reforming the system based on making sure that the students can leave and in this paradigm be able to progress to the next stage comfortably?
We make the reforms on the basis of what will best give a chance for the underlying aims to be achieved. And if you take the reforms in primary schools, the fact that the new national curriculum is being introduced in a big bang sort of approach, everyone will do it apart from 2-year groups. That is ridiculous. If this was being done in a sensible, rational sort of way, it would be introduced at the start of each key stage, i.e. at the age 5 and age 7, and then roll through. And it comes to the point I made earlier about the pace of change. One of the things driving that is Michael Gove's desire to build his own legacy. He's a man in too much of a hurry.
James Tooley, let me bring you in there. Is this clash between teachers and Michael Gove? And let's be honest, Michael Gove really rubs teachers up the wrong way. I'm sure he has his supporters amongst the teaching body, but in general, he does seem to rub teachers up the wrong way. Is that getting in the way of a wider discussion about policy?
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to overdo it. I mean, you've got a very reasonable spokesperson there from the NAHT talking, and some of the unions are very vocal in their disapproval of Michael Gove, but many teachers that I know are in favour. So it's not as quite as clear cut as that. But no, I mean, what Michael Gove believes, I guess, is that some of the problems that are leading to low standards, that are leading to disaffection amongst students, are precisely that the teaching body hasn't been motivated in the right way to raise standards, and so his view, I guess, is that you've got to shake things up, and I think he's shaking them up in pretty good ways. I mean, against what Margaret is saying, he's aiming to treble the number of top graduates coming into teaching through Teach First by the next school year. He's doing various things to try and improve the quality of teaching, and I think breaking the monopolies, allowing freedom. Educational freedom is another word for, or is the other side of allowing competition. If you allow educational freedom to come in, then you can see how things can improve. There is a definite problem, which has been mentioned by several of the panelists this afternoon, looking at, focused on the politicization of education. It has been a terrible political football ever since governments got involved in a big way, probably since 1944 and beyond. That is a huge problem. And again, you see, if you've got educational freedom entrenched, then the freedoms cannot be encroached on by politicians. It becomes less of a political football.
One of the incentives for schools to become academies, if they're not being forced to do so because of poor performance, are these alleged freedoms, freedom from local authorities and so on, but also curricular freedom. Now, I think that's a bit of an illusion because of the point I was making before about accountability. If you take secondary schools, the way in which the new accountability framework will work is that it's virtually defining which subjects young people will study between the ages of 14 to 16, not based on the freedom for schools to develop a curriculum which they consider to be most appropriate, but because of the subjects that are going to have to be taken in order for the school to perform in the new reformed performance table regime.
Margaret Heffernan, you've been patiently trying to come in now for a while.
I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think the absolute obsession with exams is really remarkable because what it's doing is it's teaching kids from the very youngest ages that really they're winners or losers. And, of course, the losers, of course, quickly decide, well, there's nothing in this for me, and so they opt out. I think it's very much predicated on the notion that somehow an exam or teachers or a system can pick winners, even though there is absolutely no meaningful evidence to suggest that any system or any people are outstandingly good at picking talent. And what it's doing is it divides people, it divides teachers, it divides kids, and it doesn't yield the love of learning, which is what we fundamentally need to inculcate in our kids from the outset and for the rest of their lives. So I think this obsession with exams and with creating a market economy where there are high prices and high-value students and low-value students is so divisive that you can't be surprised that the people who come out of it turn out to be very poor collaborators, often very
But Margaret,
poor.
how do you evaluate? How do you measure things?
Implicit in this.
How do you measure things? How do you evaluate?
By teaching, first of all, you have to insist that your teachers are qualified and that they continue to learn about learning themselves. Then you have to trust them. You have to trust them to know the students well and to provide comprehensive, consistent feedback. The high-performing education systems of the world do not achieve their results by endless examination. They achieve their results by investing heavily in
That's complete nonsense.
How do the people get measured at universities? I mean, that is completely exam-based.
The point at university is to learn. It's not to get the grades, it's to learn. And it's extraordinary when I find myself teaching graduate students that they're concerned about grades, not the learning. And that is a lesson they have learned usually since the age of 5.
I think it's more of a fact that employers,
people who think they're there for the paperwork.
Employers have set the trend by measuring how well a person has done by the grades that they see on their certificates.
I think that's completely misleading. Every boss I know, and I spend my life working with people who run companies, every boss I know knows that grades are no indicator of performance at work at all.
But Margaret, if you were interviewing two people for a position and you have two candidates in front of you who are both, in all other respects, you could go either way, and one has a first-class degree and one has a second-class degree, most employers would go with the candidate with the first-class degree.
Not necessarily at all. I mean, for example, you can talk to a lot of firms and they'll tell you that they don't rate the grades at all. They're interested in what else have people done in their lives, what other skills can they demonstrate, how do they work with other people when they come in for work experience, for interviews. We all know that the grades are meaningless, and we also know that very often these kids who have gazillions of A's, all they're good at doing is exactly what they're told to do, because that's what testing tests, your ability to do exams well. It doesn't say whether you're going to be creative, have a lot of initiative, be a good coworker.
But isn't that perhaps something that we should be building into our curriculum, soft skills training and so on? Isn't that perhaps something we need to look at?
But you don't. But the proof of the pudding isn't the grades. And one reason that we have rising levels of cheating and lying and plagiarism at school and at university is because what the kids have absorbed is the message that this isn't about learning and it's not for me, it's just for the piece of paper. And that level of disenchantment towards learning.
We're very nearly out of time, but I just want to come back to each of you briefly just to get a final comment. Really, where do we need to go from here? Diane?
I think that based on the evidence that we have seen in the past and where we are in the league table around the world, that there has to be an element of testing and being able to measure, so as an individual can measure themselves and aspire. And I think to have a free-for-all where everybody is all the same, I don't think is real in our society today.
Shaun Humphreys, where we can go.
International comparisons, because there's an increasing body of research now suggesting that the claims made for PISA are actually need to be challenged. Cambridge Assessment this week, some American research out last week. Dan, you talked about 21st century education.
Yes.
We're moving towards a system where we're assessing people by putting them in hot, sweaty gymnasiums for 2 to 3 hours on a June afternoon and saying this is the way we assess people's abilities.
And I don't agree with that.
You're also talking about the use of technology. Well, let's link those two things and see how technology can be used intelligently to assess the sorts of skills, but certainly Margaret has been talking about.
James Tooley, a last word from you where we could go or should go from here.
Michael Gove should emphasize deregulation, breaking monopolies, educational freedoms, and not get tempted by centralized control.
And Margaret Heffernan.
I think we need to focus education back on the passionate relationship between teachers in students. We need to respect and keep training our teachers, and we have to accept that education is far too important to be put out to the market.
My thanks to all of you for a really interesting and lively discussion here on Radio VR. My thanks to my guests Diane Shawe, Shaun Humphreys, Professor James Tooley and Margaret Heffernan. Stay with Radio VR.